Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life? Like you're standing in a room full of people, but no one truly sees you? This is the story of Alexis Monroe, a woman who understood the language of machines better than anyone. Yet in a world of men, she was treated like a curiosity, a token to be checked off a list. At 29, she was the first black woman to operate an M1 A2 tank at Fort Bliss, but to her peers, she was just Miss Reverse, a nickname given after a mistake. Each laugh, each slight, was a blade she had to endure in silence. But Alexis carried a secret weapon in her heart, the quiet wisdom of her late father, a mechanic who taught her that a machine isn't just metal and wires, but a partner that speaks if you are patient enough to listen. This is the story of how a woman found her voice not with words, but with a 40-ton tank, and proved that true strength isn't about fitting in, but about having the courage to stand out. Under the merciless Texas sun, the training field shimmered with heat. The air vibrated with the clanking of distant engines, shouts of soldiers, and the dry scrape of gravel beneath boots. On the center of the field, an M1 A2 tank jerked violently and came to a dead halt, dust curling up around its treads. "Someone get her off that tank. She's gonna break the gearbox." Sergeant Barkley's voice cracked through the air like a whip, followed by a chorus of snickers from the observation platform. Inside the tank, Alexis Monroe sat frozen, her back rigid against the seat, lips pressed into a line so tight it hurt. Her hands trembled on the controls, but never left them. Heat burned along her cheeks, but she refused to let the soldiers see even a flicker of shame. She could feel every mocking gaze, every muttered joke slicing at the armor she'd built around herself since arriving at Fort Bliss. 9 agonizing minutes passed. Laughter floated across the field, cruel and careless. Yet Alexis didn't call for help. She didn't move. She let her eyes close for just a moment, shutting out the humiliation, and listened. Her father's voice rose in her memory, low and certain, the same way it had sounded in their garage years ago. "A machine isn't just metal and wires, baby girl. You gotta listen to what it's trying to tell you." Her father, gone since she was 16, taken by a training accident the Army never talked about much, had spent countless weekends teaching her the secret language of engines. They'd crouched under hoods and over gearboxes, hands greasy, the smell of hot oil heavy in the air. He'd taught her that machines spoke in their own way, a stutter in a gear shift, a tremor in a belt, a pause in an engine's breath. Those lessons felt more urgent now than any manual she'd studied in basic training. The tank was silent, its systems dark, but Alexis felt it. Something in the transmission hesitated, a rhythm she recognized from long ago. Slowly, methodically, she ran her fingers across the control panel, not in panic but with deliberate care. She wasn't just flipping switches. She was speaking back to the machine in the language her father had taught her. From the observation deck, soldiers started to drift away, convinced the exercise was over. Some were already calling for the recovery vehicle. Sergeant Barkley shook his head with theatrical disappointment, shouting, "See that? Barbie dolls can't drive real tanks." The words carried across the field, each syllable hitting her like a physical blow. Still, she didn't flinch. She breathed in the faint smell of hot metal and dust, letting the noise of the crowd fade to a distant hum. She wasn't thinking about Barkley or the smirks or the nickname Miss Reverse they'd pinned on her after she'd backed a Humvee into a barrier her first week. She wasn't thinking about the long, lonely meals in the mess hall, where she'd sit in the corner, pretending not to hear the laughter from nearby tables. All she thought about was the machine beneath her. Then her fingers found the right sequence. A soft click, a subtle hum. The tank came back to life. Alexis eased it into motion, muscles tight with focus. Slowly at first, then faster, she maneuvered it into the exercise zone. At the 9-minute mark, she twisted the lever with surgical precision. The M1 A2 spun on its treads, perfectly cutting off the simulated enemy advance. Silence blanketed the field. The laughter evaporated. Soldiers stared as if the tank itself had defied them. Only one man recognized the maneuver for what it was, an old trick from a mechanic's mind, not a standard-issue tactic. Alexis Monroe, 29 years old, the first black woman to drive an M1 A2 tank at Fort Bliss, had just turned humiliation into mastery, and she had done it without ever leaving her seat. The next series of events would shift everything in ways Alexis couldn't yet imagine. The exercise had ended, and what came after felt less like a professional critique and more like a public execution. Sergeant Barkley stood in front of the assembled unit with the kind of practiced authority that fed on the humiliation of others. He paced with deliberate slowness, his boots echoing off the concrete, until his gaze settled on Alexis like a laser sight. "We're here to train combat soldiers," he announced, voice sharp enough to cut steel, "not run a vocational school. Out there, the enemy isn't going to wait for you to figure out which pedal makes the tank move forward." His words stung worse than the desert sun. Around her, the other soldiers didn't break formation, didn't laugh outright, but Alexis saw the truth in their eyes. Smirks that flickered and died. Glances exchanged like whispered commentary. The silent message clear. They thought she'd failed. Her punishment came dressed as routine procedure. Alexis was reassigned to technical inspection duty, an assignment that made it obvious who was at fault, even if the real problem had been an electronic malfunction that no driver could have prevented. That evening, the ridicule followed her to the mess hall. At the next table, a group of soldiers ordered something they made sure to call the Miss Stall platter, their voices carrying just far enough to draw attention. When the waitress delivered the food, one soldier leaned back and said, loud enough for half the dining facility to hear, "Hope this doesn't break down halfway through the meal, like some people's driving." The roar of laughter that followed struck her like a physical blow. Alexis kept her face still, her hands moving in a precise rhythm, cutting her food into neat pieces, chewing slowly, swallowing pride with every bite. The mess hall's clatter of silverware and chatter faded around her, replaced by a memory of her father's garage. She could almost smell the oil and metal, feel the warm buzz of the summer air thick with gasoline. She saw herself at 10 years old, holding a flashlight in small, steady hands, while her father wrestled with a stubborn engine. "A machine isn't just metal and wires, baby girl," he'd told her in that patient, gravelly voice. "You gotta listen to what it's trying to tell you. Every sound, every vibration, every hesitation, it's all communication." Her father wasn't just a mechanic. He was a machine whisperer. He could hear problems no sensor could detect, solve puzzles the computers couldn't solve. And when he died in that training accident, he left her more than a box of tools. He left her that intuition, that quiet certainty that patience and listening were as critical as force or speed. That night, after lights out, Alexis slipped from the barracks and made her way to the motor pool. The space was silent except for the low hum of security lights. The hulking silhouettes of tanks and armored vehicles loomed like sleeping giants, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. She climbed into the M1 A2 that had humiliated her, easing into the driver's seat as if visiting an old friend. Alone in the quiet, without an audience waiting to judge her, she began to practice. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Each gear shift was a conversation, each sound a clue. Her open notebook rested beside her as she documented every flicker, every irregularity in the electronics, patterns the official diagnostics had missed. This wasn't just practice, it was a language lesson. She was learning to hear the tank speak the way her father had once taught her to listen to engines. 3 hours passed in the dim light of the motor pool. She ran through scenario after scenario, testing every possible combination, until she could feel the subtle change in the transmission as naturally as breathing. By the time she trudged back to the barracks, sweat clung to her uniform like a second skin. But inside, something had shifted. She understood the tank now. The next morning arrived with the announcement of a new exercise. This one was a rescue simulation. Tank crews would have to navigate hostile terrain to extract a disabled vehicle under the watchful eyes of simulated enemy positions. When the roster was called, Alexis heard her name. The moment her name appeared on the mission roster, Alexis Monroe could practically feel the groan ripple through the soldiers around her. She didn't need to see their faces. She could sense the disappointment, the muttered curses, the shared belief that she didn't belong. This was it, her final shot. One last chance to prove herself in the M1 A2 or be reassigned to some non-combat support role, far from the driver's seat of the machine she loved. The exercise began the way it always did, with basic maneuvers and formation runs. Alexis handled the tank smoothly, her hands steady on the controls. But she knew the real test hadn't come yet. It waited ahead, the infamous bottleneck. Two massive boulders jutted from the desert floor, creating a jagged passage barely wide enough for the tank's 12-foot hull. No crew had successfully navigated it yet. Most had given up before reaching the midpoint. Some had gotten stuck, requiring a tow. For Alexis, failure here wouldn't just be another mark against her. It would be the end of the road. As she approached the narrow gap, she deliberately shifted the M1 A2 into its lowest gear. The tank crawled forward, its engine rumbling like a caged beast forced to tiptoe. The radio crackled almost immediately with sarcastic commentary from the observation post. "Here we go again. Somebody get the tow truck ready. Miss Stahl's about to make history. How long before she gets wedged this time?" The mockery was nothing new. Normally it stung. Normally it made her feel like she was sinking under a weight she couldn't shake. But today, the voices seemed to drift away, muffled and distant, as if she were listening from underwater. Her father's voice rose in her memory instead, calm, deliberate, patient. People who talk the loudest usually know the least about what they're watching, Lex. He'd been right about everything. He always was. She let herself sink into the rhythm of the machine, feeling the tank's treads respond to the uneven ground. Every pebble, every ridge beneath the steel seemed to speak to her through the vibrations in the seat and the tension in the controls. The observers thought she was hesitating, paralyzed by fear or incompetence. They couldn't see what was happening inside her head. Alexis wasn't stalling. She was calculating, waiting for the one perfect alignment that would let 40 tons of steel thread the impossible needle. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then 8. "Just quit already," someone barked over the radio. "We're wasting daylight." She didn't hear them anymore. All she could hear was the deep hum of the engine and the faint grinding of treads against rock. She was waiting for the machine to tell her it was ready. At exactly 9 minutes and 37 seconds, long after most of the observers had sighed, turned their backs, and started walking away, Alexis made her move. Her hands moved across the controls with a confidence born not of arrogance, but of mastery. A slow, deliberate turn of the lever, a micro-adjustment on the pedals, and the front tracks kissed the narrow gap between the boulders with surgical precision. Then, impossibly, the 40-ton tank began to pivot. The M1 A2 rotated in a controlled 110-degree turn, its hulking frame spinning like a dancer executing a perfectly rehearsed routine. Dust kicked up around it, curling in the hot desert air. Its bulk should have felt ungainly, but under Alexis's command, the machine moved with a kind of improbable grace. What she had just done wasn't only technically remarkable, it was tactically brilliant. By turning the tank sideways within the bottleneck, she'd created a movable barrier, a shield that could block enemy advancement while maintaining multiple firing angles. The range went silent. No jokes, no laughter, just stunned silence. From the command post, Lieutenant Colonel Houston lowered his binoculars and strode toward the tank, his pace brisk, his expression unreadable. 25 years in the Army had taught him to recognize the difference between luck and skill. This wasn't luck. This was mastery, the kind you only saw once in a career. "Who taught you that maneuver?" he called, his voice cutting through the dry wind. The commander's hatch opened and Alexis emerged. Her face was slick with sweat, her eyes sharp and steady. "My father, sir," she said simply. "He used to work on older tanks. I've been practicing this every night." Houston nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then he turned toward the gathering of soldiers and training staff, his voice carrying like a command that left no room for argument. "That maneuver," he said, "was used in Fallujah, urban combat, specialized crews only." And for a moment, the entire training ground seemed to stand still. Everyone watching the woman they'd mocked do what none of them could. The weight of what had just happened began to settle over Alexis Monroe like a slow-moving tide. Lieutenant Colonel Houston's words weren't just a passing compliment. They meant something deeper, something life-altering. Her maneuver hadn't been a fluke, not some desperate gamble that happened to work. She had executed a combat technique so precise, so instinctive, that most career tank operators never even came close to mastering it. It wasn't luck. It was skill, hard-earned and undeniable. Across the training field, Sergeant Barkley's face had drained of color. A few minutes earlier, he had been smirking, ready to watch her fail. Now his jaw hung tight, and he looked like a man confronting a truth he didn't want to admit. Just a few yards away, the soldier who had been recording her with the clear intent of capturing a humiliating mistake slowly lowered his phone. He blinked at the screen as if the device had betrayed him. Instead of a moment to laugh at, he had filmed something extraordinary, something that no one would ever forget. Alexis descended from the M1 A2 tank with movements that were steady, controlled, and, for the first time since she'd set foot on Fort Bliss, utterly confident. Her boots crunched against the dirt, and she felt different, as if the ground itself recognized her now. Inside the chest pocket of her uniform, she could feel the familiar weight of her father's old service medal pressing against her heart. The small, tarnished piece of metal had been with her every step of this journey, a quiet reminder of the lessons he drilled into her when she was just a girl in his garage. Patience, precision, and trusting your instincts even when everyone around you said you couldn't. He had believed in her before anyone else did. Lieutenant Colonel Houston stepped forward, his face solemn but full of respect. He raised his hand in a formal salute. Nothing casual, nothing perfunctory. It was the kind of salute reserved for soldiers who had proven something undeniable on the field. The moment was almost surreal for Alexis. Then his voice carried across the silent training yard, sharp and clear. If anyone here still believes that skill is determined by gender or background, rather than dedication and ability, he said, scanning the faces of the gathered soldiers, you need to learn from this soldier right here. A heavy silence followed, thick enough to feel in the air. But it wasn't awkward. No one shifted uncomfortably or muttered under their breath. This was the kind of silence that meant people were thinking, rethinking, everything they had assumed about her, and maybe about themselves. One by one, the soldiers reacted. A few took off their helmets, a gesture of respect that carried weight in a place where pride was currency. Others just stared, wide-eyed, processing what they had just witnessed. The shift in the air was almost tangible, like the training field itself had changed shape around her. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow, tentative. It echoed in the open space, a solitary acknowledgement that this moment deserved more than silence. Another pair joined in, then another. Within seconds, the applause swelled, rolling over the training ground in a wave. This wasn't the stiff, perfunctory clapping of a ceremony. This was raw, honest recognition, an entire unit acknowledging excellence that transcended every preconception they'd carried in with them. For the first time in her military career, Alexis felt the shift. She was no longer just the outsider, the novelty, the one they whispered about when they thought she couldn't hear. In this moment, they saw her as an equal. Sergeant Barkley approached her cautiously, his earlier swagger gone. He stopped a step away, cleared his throat, and said quietly, "Monroe, I owe you an apology, and I'd like to learn that maneuver if you're willing to teach it." She studied his face. This wasn't just about tactics or tank handling. This was a man admitting that she had something valuable to teach, that her knowledge and skill mattered. It was an acknowledgement that respect had to be earned, and she had earned it. As the crowd slowly dispersed, a few soldiers lingered to approach her. Their questions weren't about her limitations anymore. They wanted to know how she had done it, why it worked, and what she knew that they didn't. For once, at Carmelian, the conversations at Fort Bliss were about her expertise, not her supposed shortcomings. A young private, one who had laughed the loudest at her during training, stepped forward. His helmet wobbled in his hands, and his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Ma'am, I recorded the whole thing. I was gonna, I was gonna post it online to make fun of you." His eyes darted to the ground. "But now, I think people should see it for the right reasons. Would that be okay?" Alexis hesitated, her fingers brushing against the metal in her pocket. A part of her wanted to say no, to keep this moment untouched by the world outside. But then she remembered her father's voice in her mind, the way he'd always said that knowledge and persistence weren't meant to be hoarded. They were meant to be shared. "You can post it," she said finally, "but make sure people understand. This isn't about one person doing something flashy. It's about what's possible when you really know what you're working with, when you take the time to understand it. Lieutenant Colonel Houston, who had been standing close enough to hear, stepped in again, his tone measured but carrying a new note of excitement. "Monroe," he said, "I'd like to recommend you for advanced tactical training. With your mechanical background and the instinctive way you handle vehicle dynamics, you could be an exceptional instructor for specialized operations." The words sank into her like the sun breaking through a storm. Everything she had been working toward, every doubt she had swallowed, every whispered joke she had ignored, every hour spent in that garage with her father, it was all pointing to this moment. This was what Alexis Monroe had secretly hoped for when she first signed her enlistment papers. Not just a place in the military, but the kind of recognition that went deeper than a salute or a passing nod. She had wanted proof that her skills, her persistence, and the lessons her father had burned into her bones could earn her a place where respect was not given lightly, but earned through action. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Fort Bliss training grounds as Alexis climbed back into the driver's seat of her M1 A2 Abrams tank. The air shimmered with desert heat, and the scent of sun-baked sand and machine oil filled her lungs. She ran her hand over the familiar controls, felt the vibration of the engine beneath her, and for the first time, everything felt different. The tank's metallic heartbeat wasn't just noise anymore. It was a voice she understood, a steady rhythm that spoke of partnership and triumph. From her breast pocket, she drew out her father's old metal token, the one she had carried since she was 16. Its edges were smooth from years of handling, its surface still dull and scratched. But when she held it up to the fading sunlight, it glinted as if alive. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the engine's hum. "You were right. Patience and skill will always outlast the noise and the doubters." The tank purred quietly under her hands, not the roar of a machine that had once betrayed her in front of sneering onlookers, but the steady voice of a comrade, the partner that had carried her through the moment she proved who she really was. In the days that followed that now famous demonstration, everything in Alexis's world shifted. The invitation arrived in her inbox like a spark she didn't expect. She had been selected to lead advanced training for incoming recruits, specifically in high-level tank maneuvering techniques. The change in how the base treated her was immediate, almost jarring. In the mess hall, conversations no longer froze when she walked in. Soldiers who had once rolled their eyes or snickered now actively sought her out, asking for help with mechanical issues that had stumped even the regular maintenance teams. Her name carried weight now, but the weight had been forged, not gifted. On the third day of her new role, Alexis climbed into her tank and found something unexpected sitting on the driver's seat. A cold can of soda with a small handwritten note taped to it. "Thank you for making me shut up with skill instead of words. Barkley." It wasn't a formal apology, not by military standards, but Alexis knew what it meant. In a world where respect was usually filtered through rank and protocol, this was something rarer, an acknowledgement that could only be earned, never demanded. Soon after, the technical training department did something unprecedented. They officially adopted Alexis's tank rotation maneuver into the field manual. For the first time in Fort Bliss history, a technique developed by a new recruit became part of the standard specialized operations curriculum. Lieutenant Colonel Houston personally recommended that the move be named the Monroe Maneuver, ensuring her name would appear in training programs across multiple bases for years to come. The recognition didn't just live on paper, it rippled through the very culture around her. Young recruits who had once dismissed her as a novelty, the girl in the tank, now approached with wide-eyed curiosity. Their questions weren't about her gender or her skin, but about torque, gear ratios, and the strange mechanical intuition behind her skills. One evening, while the desert air cooled and the last orange light slipped behind the horizon, Alexis worked under the hood of her tank during a maintenance session. A small crowd of soldiers gathered around, listening intently as she explained how to diagnose transmission problems not just with tools, but with the ear. "Machines talk," she said, brushing oil from her fingers. "You just have to learn to listen." Private Chen, who had been one of the loudest voices laughing during her first humiliating day, finally worked up the nerve to ask, "How did you know the tank wasn't really broken back then?" Alexis paused, weighing the memory. "The same way you know when someone's voice sounds off when they're sick. Engines have voices too. If you stop assuming and start listening, they'll tell you exactly what's wrong. Her words sparked a conversation that outlasted the fading light and even the official duty hours. Soldiers leaned against the tank treads, talking about the difference between textbook knowledge and the gut-deep instinct that only came from truly knowing your machine. That late-night session would eventually influence how the unit approached technical training for years to come. 3 weeks later, Alexis found herself in the motor pool office, standing in front of the wall of framed photographs reserved for Fort Bliss's distinguished instructors and innovators. Her eyes landed on a new addition, a snapshot of her tank captured at the precise moment she executed the Monroe Maneuver. She saw herself there, a dark silhouette against the desert sun, the tank in motion, a perfect circle of dust rising behind it. For a long time, she just stood there, letting the quiet pride settle in. This wasn't just a photograph. It was proof that she had taken every doubt, every laugh, every whispered, "She doesn't belong here," and turned it into something permanent. Her father would have understood. When 40 tons of steel slid through an impossibly narrow space with the grace of an athlete, the photograph captured that moment perfectly. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "Specialist Alexis Monroe, Innovation Through Understanding." That evening, Alexis returned to the small, personal corner of her workshop. On top of her old tool cabinet sat her father's photograph, framed behind a sheet of glass she polished often. She ran her finger along the image, pausing on the familiar curve of his smile. Memories crowded in, those long afternoons in the garage, the two of them covered in grease, her father explaining that machines spoke their own language if you were patient enough to listen. "I think you'd be proud, Dad," she whispered. "I finally found people who understand what you taught me." Inside her desk drawer, next to her father's tarnished service medal, was a letter she had read a dozen times. Lieutenant Colonel Houston had recommended her for promotion to specialist and for placement in the Army's Advanced Tactical Vehicle Development Program. Yet no piece of paper, no official praise, meant as much as the quiet truth she carried inside. She had proven what her father had always believed, that skill and patience would speak louder than prejudice, louder than doubt. Word of Alexis Monroe's story didn't outspread through the usual channels. There were no newspaper features, no formal announcements. It traveled the way the best stories do in the military, over coffee in mess halls, between barracks at night, in the offhand way soldiers talk about someone who's earned their respect. Her technique with the M1 A2 tank became the stuff of legend, not because it was flashy, but because it embodied a simple truth. Real honor isn't about rank or recognition. It lives in the persistence of perfecting your craft when no one believes you belong. She didn't seek apologies from those who had laughed at her, mocked her, or dismissed her. All she ever wanted was the steering wheel in her hands and a chance to show the world what skill and determination could accomplish together. 6 months later, a quiet shift began at Fort Bliss. Young female recruits started requesting assignment there, not because they were chasing headlines or trying to make a statement, but because of Specialist Monroe. Her reputation had grown. She was the soldier who could teach you to listen to a machine the way some people listen to music. One afternoon, during a grueling advanced maneuvering exercise, a recruit stalled her tank for the third time and finally blurted out, "How did you keep going when everyone expected you to fail?" Alexis paused, considering her words before answering. "My father taught me that machines don't care who you are or where you come from. They respond to competence and patience. If you can earn a machine's respect, earning human respect, that comes after." The recruit scribbled those words in her training journal. Over time, that line became part of the unspoken wisdom that ripples through generations of soldiers, the kind of truth passed hand to hand, never written in any manual. Months later, at the ceremony where Alexis received her promotion to technical sergeant, she pinned her father's service medal beneath her new stripes. Lieutenant Colonel Houston's voice carried across the parade ground as he addressed the crowd. He spoke of innovations that come from laboratories and years of research, and the rarer kind that comes from a single individual who finds excellence in the quiet moments when no one is watching. The recognition that meant the most to Alexis, though, came far from the stage. During a base-wide vehicle inspection, the commanding general paused to observe her with a group of trainees. She was bent over the open chassis of a stubborn tank, diagnosing a transmission failure, that had baffled the official maintenance team. "Specialist Monroe," the general said, "walk me through your process." She straightened and wiped her hands on a rag, speaking in the calm, measured tone her father had used when teaching her. "Sir, my father always said that every machine has a personality. If you take the time to learn it, problems stop being mysteries. They become conversations." The general lingered for a long moment, watching her work. Later, he told his staff that he had witnessed something rare: a soldier who had taken the institution's knowledge and transformed it into personal wisdom. Years down the line, when military historians documented the evolution of armored vehicle training, they would mark the emergence of what became known as the Monroe Maneuver. It was more than a tactical innovation. It was a turning point, a moment when the Army quietly acknowledged that brilliance often comes from those willing to listen first and speak through action later. The most valuable insights often come from those whose voices have been ignored for far too long. Alexis Monroe knew that truth deep in her bones. She never forgot the first time she felt the cold press of her father's old wrench against her chest, the weight of metal and memory, as she successfully maneuvered a tank for the very first time. That moment lived in her like a quiet ember. Every time she slid into the driver's seat and coaxed the rumbling heart of an M1 A2 to life, she could almost hear him again, her father's calm voice threading through the engine's growl. "Patience will outlast the noise. Understanding will outshine assumption." Those words were her shield and her compass. They reminded her that true mastery didn't need to be announced. It revealed itself in every smooth shift, every flawless maneuver, every quiet victory no one expected from her. Respect, she learned, wasn't always shouted or granted in a ceremony. Sometimes it was earned in the small, steady moments. One turn of a wrench, one calculated movement of a tank treading across the desert, until there was no one left who could deny it.